Good morning. How are you all doing today? It's good to see you. Some faces we haven't seen for a while, some faces we see quite a bit. It's great to have you all here. And again, welcome to the Sherwood Seventh-day Adventist Church. Today, our sermon is on the eighth commandment. It's entitled Stealing Trust. Now, I got a question for you. And this is by show of hands. How many of you grew up keeping the door of your house unlocked? A lot of you grew up keeping the door of your house unlocked. Now, I grew up when I was very little. I lived for about 7 years, just about half an hour outside of Los Angeles. So that was not my reality of keeping the door unlocked. And that habit continued on when we moved up to Idaho, although it was a much safer, less theft-prone area. We kept the door locked out of habit from what we had learned down in Southern California. And now, after Lindsay and I had gotten married, we ended up, the job that I was planning on having and had talked to, and things were going pretty well towards me having that job when I graduated from college. Then the economy crashed, and that completely fell through. And so Lindsay and I ended up moving in with her parents for a little bit, and there I learned all of the intricacies of having a security system on the house. And they didn't always, and I think both of her parents had actually grown up with the whole, the door's open kind of thing. The door's unlocked, and that was the reality that they had until there was a break-in. And at that point, the things that had been taken or were lined up to be taken, I think someone came home just in time to really stop any actual theft from taking place, and the thieves ran before they got anything or anything of significant value. But at that point, they decided that they were going to have a security system installed. And then living in some of the places that we have lived, we have also made sure that we generally try and pick a good, safe, kind of secluded neighborhood, but there's still that lingering thing because Lindsay's parents were in a good, safe, kind of secluded neighborhood and had to break in. So we have that security system kind of thing on our house as well. And it comes from a lack of trust. That idea to put up a security system, it comes from a lack of trust. To make sure that the doors are locked, when you leave the house, all of that, it comes from a lack of trust. Those of you who were raised where the door was unlocked, I'm going to guess, no one ever really broke into your home, did they? No. And it probably wasn't, and you may still be someone who, the door is unlocked. I don't know. Some people still operate that way and don't really do a whole lot about locking their doors because they've always had that basic trust in the humans around them. But for those who have had that trust taken away by one means or another, we tend to go and we rely on locks and security systems and all these various kinds of things, right? But there's something about a lock, is that a lock will only keep an honest man honest, right? Someone who is not bound and determined to commit an act of theft, if they see a lock, that all it's doing is stopping them from committing a crime of opportunity. In many cases, that someone might look and see, oh, hey, this is kind of tempting. Let's do this, and here's this bike that hasn't been locked up, and it disappears from the wreck that it was on. But for those who want to go about and committing acts of theft, a lock will not stop them. And even a security system may not stop them. But we put up all the kinds of deterrents that we can to protect what is ours, right? To protect the property that we have invested ourselves in, and to protect the lives that are inside our homes. And when someone comes through and tries to take something that doesn't belong to them, it's a violation of the basic trust that we put in the people around us. And this is one of the reasons that God sets out this eighth commandment, is to keep trust alive, especially among his people. We're going to look here into Exodus chapter 20. We're going to see, remember that this is coming. All of these things that we're reading, these 10 commandments, is then God spoke all these words saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That these things are given because God has given them, God has spoken them, and God had a claim to give this law because of the deliverance that he had given to the people. And then we see, you shall not steal. Now there's all kinds of things, I could just call it here and just, God's saying, don't take things and property that isn't yours. And that's all very straightforward, isn't it? Like it all just makes sense right there. Don't take stuff that doesn't belong to you. And end sermon. But we want to go a little bit deeper here. We want to go deeper here because of where we see kind of stealing throughout the Bible and what's going on here. We go just a couple of chapters later, and we see some of what goes on in the penalty for stealing, that how God was wanting to stop theft from happening within his people. Now, in Exodus chapter 22, we see a lot here. And before we get into all of this, I want to talk about the Code of Hammurabi, the ancient Babylonian code that determined penalties and laws regarding theft and other things. And one of the big things in the Code of Hammurabi that some in the Middle East still cling to today is that if someone steals, their hand is removed from them. If you're caught stealing, the hand that the goods are in as you're stealing, you don't get to keep it. They'll heat up a sword and cut off your hand at the wrist. They heat it up so that it cauterizes so you don't just bleed out and die from it. And then forever after that, you are branded as a thief because you're missing a hand. But that was only for the poor people in the Code of Hammurabi. The rich people, if they were caught in any kind of theft, all they had to do was pay a fine that was larger than the value of the theft. It was an unequal thing because, the poor people, they're not going to be able to pay a hefty or a large fine, so we'll cut off their hand and inhibit them economically. They're less likely able to work and then are probably more likely to end up going into thieving more because I've already lost one hand. I've got no other work I can do. I might as well, it's kind of a perverse incentive to encourage a life of crime there, the way the Code of Hammurabi does it. But God goes through and he says, look, here's the deal. It says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So if you steal something and it's slaughtered or sold out, and if you're caught in the theft, but it's already out of your hands, you pay back fivefold for an ox, fourfold for a sheep. If the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account. So if he's breaking in and you're like, the property owner, the homeowner, gets into a fight with him and ends up killing him in the process, the person who's protecting their home and their property and their lives is not considered blood guilty as this is set up, because someone's coming in to violate their trust and violate their property. It says, but if the sun is risen on him, there will be blood guiltiness on his account. So if I find out, if someone came and broke into my home and stole something from me, and I find out who it is, let's say I see them selling it on Facebook Marketplace or something, so I go and I set something up, and then I start a fight and end up killing them, then I'm guilty in that case. But if it's in the heat of the moment, the guilt isn't there. And we see, looking at this intent and dealing with all of these things. In this case, he shall surely make restitution. If he owns nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. So again, there's that whole thing of, in that case, if he's caught, then he has to make restitution. And if he can't, then he's sold into slavery so that his work and his time as a slave will cover the cost of his theft. If what he stole is actually found alive in his possession, whether an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So you get that returned and then two more on top of that. If a man lets a field or vineyard be grazed bare and lets his animal loose so that it grazes in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. So, sheep are notorious for being really bad grazers, because they will, when they're going through and they're grazing in a spot with grass, is their teeth don't cut the grass above the root. They grab and then they tear the whole plant out. They tear the whole bit of grass out, the root and all. And so if someone has a bunch of sheep and they're not watching where their sheep are growing, and they're not letting that grass kind of go to seed again and start spreading again, and they're, oh, well, how am I going to feed my sheep? Well, I'll just they broke out and, oh, they grazed on someone else's field. I'm so sorry my sheep got out, whatever. It's like, okay, well, you have to repay the damage with the best of your field of the equivalent type. See, if a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes, so that stacked grain or the standing grain or the field itself is consumed, he who started the fire shall surely make restitution. This is something that we even do in the United States with wildfires. It's been a little bit more recent. It hasn't always been, but in order to recover the costs of fighting wildfires, if it is a case of arson, the person responsible is liable for all of the costs of putting out that fire. Over in Oregon and Washington, there was a fairly famous case about this, of a couple of teenage boys who started a fire that ended up just completely engulfing the Columbia River Gorge and area. And I mean, we're talking, this was hundreds of millions of dollars of effort to put out this massive fire. And then it was found out that these two teenage boys had done this, and they were prosecuted. They were tried and prosecuted. They were found guilty and had to pay back the states of Oregon and Washington to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, they were not children of billionaires or 100 millionaires. They didn't have that, but the principle that we have and have had is kind of there, but especially out west when the wildfires take off, that level of restitution doesn't often happen. Some of the wildfires that have happened recently in the last few summers in California have it's been determined that because Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, was not taking care of, they weren't trimming things back, they weren't keeping their power grid safe and secure, and that some of these wild, incredibly huge fires, like the Camp Fire that happened a few years ago in Northern California, was started by power lines that ignited trees nearby, and then it just literally spread like wildfire, destroyed multiple cities in Northern California. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres of land just completely burned up and gone because of it. And the state of California held PG&E liable for that, and made that, gave them the bill for everything that Cal Fire had spent to try and put these fires out, for the costs of rebuilding houses and cities and other things that had been destroyed by this. And so now PG&E attempts to control their liability of fires. If there's going to be big winds coming through in areas where their power lines are going through forests that they aren't allowed to go in and trim, they just cut the power to the state. So if you ever look in the summer and see, online friends in California complaining about rolling blackouts and other things like this, that's the reason, that's what's going on, so that PG&E doesn't have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars because they're liable for a fire. These kinds of things coming through, this making restitution to others, is an important part of dealing with how we keep theft out of where we go. It says, if the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for ox, for donkey, for sheep, for clothing, or for any lost thing about which one says, this is it, the case of both parties shall come before the judges. He whom the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbors. So when there's arguments over, well, this is my property, no, this is my property, they'll figure that out, go to the judges. We see a similar kind of case, only now with human life involved, with King Solomon. And the two mothers who were living in the same house, and they both had children, and one of the children died in the night, and the mother of the child who had died went and switched the babies so that she could have her child alive, and they're squabbling about, well, whose child is this? And in that kind of case, Solomon, looking at the life that was there, Solomon determined that, oh, hey, we'll know who the real mother is based on who wants to protect this child's life the most. And so he orders that the child would be cut in two. The woman who actually was the mother said, no, spare the child's life, give this other woman the baby. The one who was not said, yeah, okay, then we both have dead children. Solomon understood what was right. This kind of judgment, this is the sort of thing that would go on. So you come, you bring your testimony, bring your story, and sometimes if it's not provable, you have to have a very wise judge like Solomon was in that case to determine how things are to go. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep for him, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away while no one is looking, an oath before the Lord shall be made by the two of them that he has not laid hands on his neighbor's property. This is jumping all over the place, isn't it? This really seems like the slides are jumping all over the place here. Has not laid hands on his neighbor's property, its owner shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. So if someone loans you something and it, or you're watching somebody's ox or donkey or sheep or whatever, and it disappears, wanders off, make an oath, you're not responsible for it. But if it is actually stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. And bring this into kind of modern ideas. If I borrow a tool from somebody and I don't do my due diligence to keep that tool locked up, to keep that tool safe, and it gets stolen, I'm liable for the replacement of that tool to the person I borrowed it from because I didn't lock up my stuff. It gets stolen while it's in my care. I'm responsible for that to the other person. If an animal is all torn to pieces, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn to pieces. So like a wild animal comes through and kills the livestock while he's not going to be liable for the actions of a wild animal. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while its owner is not with it, he shall make full restitution. Now this one, you could get into some kind of slimy stuff where somebody is like, okay, I know, they may have a horse that's fairly old and probably shouldn't be doing much in the way of work, should just be retired and out in the pasture and doing his thing. But the owner is like, I'd really like to be able to have this horse replaced, and starts lending it out to people in the hopes that it might die in their possession. Like, that's really slimy. And hopefully no one would do that. But this kind of thing, there's still that issue. And this is one of the things we see where the commandment, you shall not steal, is a perfect commandment. But it's when we get into the little case-by-case things, when we have that principle laid down of don't take other people's stuff, that's very simple. But when we get into the case-by-case stuff and we're like, oh, well, here's this. This is assuming that the lender is lending in good faith. That the one lending the ox or the horse or whatever is lending that in good faith so that he's not just trying to, I'll do this and get something back here. There's a subreddit, a community on the website Reddit that is called Unethical Life Pro Tips. And Unethical Life Pro Tips, one of the ones that I read a while back and it just happened to be on my, I see it on the all page at one point and was reading it, and it was like, if you have a dish with a really bad set-in stain that you just cannot seem to get out, maybe it's a glass Pyrex and there's some stuff that's just really burned on there and you just can't quite get that removed, and it always bugs you to see it because it's technically clean, but it doesn't look clean, so you don't really want to put it away. The Unethical Life Pro Tip was to make a dish in that and give that dish to a neighbor, a friend, or someone else and have them return it, because they will then do what it takes to really scrub that down and make sure it's clean, so that they're like, oh no, I can't return this dirty dish. Unethical Life Pro Tips. Don't do that. It's not kind. But these assumptions of that these things are being done in good faith are a big part of where these case-by-case laws are coming through. Say, if its owner is with it, he shall not make restitution. If it is hired, it came for its hire. So you can kind of see where, someone is renting out an ox to help somebody plow their land. And that ox is starting to get old and might die under the wear and under the work of it. So they stop renting it out and just start lending it in the hopes that they might. You can see where some of the abuses could potentially take place, where some of the bad faith actors could do things that and skew these case laws towards themselves. But in those cases, if they're lending in bad faith, they are committing an act of theft. Committing an act of theft because they're not lending, they're not giving in good faith. They're doing it to try to get something from you instead of doing that because, hey, I know you need some help plowing your field. Here, you can borrow my ox. It's a good, strong ox. It'll get the job done. But they're sending that in bad faith in the hopes that they might receive benefit and receive that back so that they can then have more oxes, right? Oxen. We look even to the New Testament, we see the issue of theft. It comes up. One of the things we see, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, the way that Paul talks about people who aren't contributing in the church is actually what the context of what Paul is talking about here. He says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. So, this is calling out the people who would come to the church and just always be, and they would join the church with the hopes of, oh, well, I'll always have my food available. I'll always have this available. And they're just trying to subsist off of the goodness, the kindness, and the love of others without contributing anything themselves. And Paul considers that stealing. I mean, now that's something that we see here. There are times where there are people who are kind of down on their luck and they ask for help. And where we can, we give them help, right? As far, where we're able to do so, we give them help in something. But if someone, and this, you have those people who go out, they panhandle because there's not really anything else they can do. And then you have people who go out and panhandle because it pays better than going to work. And they'll make themselves look like they're down on their luck. I remember recently seeing a travel tip of someone in Prague. This guy who was traveling in Prague and was trying to expose a lot of the scams that are happening there in some of the big squares. And this one woman, they show, she's got a cane and she's limping and all this other stuff while she's in the square, and she gets a few blocks away. And now that she's out of sight of the people that she's been, panhandling money from and begging for money from, now she's walking upright, swiftly gets into a car and drives home. That kind of thing is bad faith, and Paul calls that sort of activity as theft. And he's saying if there's anyone in the church especially who's doing that, then he has to stop and performing with his own hands what is good so that he will have something to share with one who has need, putting together something to contribute to others who may have need. There was a pastor, I believe of I think it was the North Dallas Baptist Church, and I may have that exact thing wrong, but it was a Baptist church in Dallas, Texas, who had said that, with his church and how they do things, they require anyone who is a member is required to be engaged in ministry of some kind, to be supporting the church and the mission of the church in some way, shape, or form. Because he said, if you want to come and receive the benefit without doing the work, he said, we have a word for that, and it's called pimping. Yeah. Now, of course, he used that term to elicit a reaction, but the reaction that it elicited was the one that was desired, where people are like, oh, we don't tend to look highly on that kind of person. And it motivated more of his members to contribute more. And for some of them, it was just making sure that they were regularly giving tithes and offerings to the church. For others, it was getting actively involved because, they didn't have a lot of money to give, but they had some time available. And so getting involved and assisting the church in those ways and doing those things. Sometimes that the provocative and the even crass is what it takes to awake us out of slumber. And Paul, in other cases, and I think I've mentioned them here before, but in other cases, Paul is quite crass. And there are cases where you read through the Bible where the Bible itself and what we see and read there is quite crass. And it's always for a purpose to wake us up out of a complacency to do what God is calling us to do what ought to be done. Paul his most crass statement was in looking at all of the things that he had done as a Pharisee, how he was, kind of top of the class. He was trained and studying under Gamaliel, one of the most highly regarded Pharisees at that time. He was on track to become a member of the Sanhedrin and all of these things. And he says, all of that is rubbish compared to Jesus Christ. And we might think, okay, well, it's trash. Well, no, actually, semantically, the word that Paul used there, he was saying that it was poo, feces. And semantically, the level of crassness that he is talking about, our modern English word, he would be saying, all of those achievements that I had, all of the following of the law that I did, and everything I had going for me before Christ was crap. And that's one of the big things that we see. Like, I will say, when I was a kid, I had an issue with wanting things that other people had and taking them. I have since recovered from that issue. It ultimately took one time that I snuck into my brother's room thinking that he was off at school, but not realizing that he was on home leave. And I was going in to steal one of his CDs from him that I had wanted. That was way under his bed, and he woke up with my feet sticking out from under his bed. Not proud of that. I did end up learning my lesson from it, though. When we look at these things of what God has done, looking at and taking from other people, it's that basic violation of trust. If someone is always just taking, and never giving, never contributing in the church, but always on the receiving end, it wearies the church members. It wearies the leaders. It wearies those who are putting in the work and who are making the effort. And it's not just other people that God tells us we should not steal from. There's also those who engage in robbing God. We see Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. We are all the property of God, the one who made us, created us. And so God makes this claim for not stealing, even on the basis of, look, if you can't bother to respect your neighbor, then do it because you respect me and I created your neighbor. If you can't bother to respect your neighbor's property, then do it because you respect me, the one who gave your neighbor the ability to have that property. And for the Israelites specifically, the one who gave your neighbor that property, they had their property and inheritance boundary markers that were never to be moved. To move those boundary markers was a grave sin. Because God had ordained these families to have these lands as inheritance when they took the land of Canaan. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 14, Moses saying to the people, behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Respecting other people's property is respecting God. It's respecting God's property, recognizing Him. Proverbs 23:10, do not move the ancient boundary or go into the fields of the fatherless. The ancient boundary, that property boundary, these things were things that were not to be done. They revealed dishonesty if they were. Moving boundary markers was never a good thing to do. And we see in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. This is after the exile, the people of Judah have returned. Their houses aren't doing so great. The Lord's house is not doing well at all. Jerusalem is not doing well. And it says, will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. You say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. I'm not going to go into a diatribe on making sure you give tithes and offerings to the church. You don't want to hear it, and I don't want to say it. I'm right. But there's something else where that is even deeper than tithes and offerings, where we rob God. And that is when we take the blessings that He has given us and we only use them selfishly. When we take the good things that He gives us, whether it is property and material goods, or whether it is just the life and the family that we can have, and we use these things only for the benefit of ourselves, and we do not serve Him wholly. The talents that we have. He is our creator. He has claim over us. And when we ignore Him, we rob God. But the law and the expectations of the law came after the deliverance. Remember, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God did the mighty deeds. He saved and delivered the people before He laid on them the requirements of what they were to do. They agreed to be His people and He their God before He laid on them the law, the covenant. So when I say that when we ignore God or we do not serve God with the things that we have, we're robbing God, that is only applicable to those of us who recognize God giving those things. We cannot hold others to that standard. God will hold them to that standard, but we cannot. That's his place in judgment, not ours. But for us, we should not steal the trust of God. It is bad enough to steal the trust of other people, but to steal the trust of God is a high crime against the kingdom of heaven that will not go without punishment. But praise God, there is always forgiveness for those things that we turn and give to him. That if we have been unintentionally stealing from God, and we say, God, I'm so sorry, I don't want to do this, he forgives us and gives us the power and the help and the strength to be able to do it the right way. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you so much for all that you do for us, for the trust that you put in us. Help us always to respect the property of others, to respect what is yours as well, to regard highly what you have done and given for us. Lord, may we never be found guilty of stealing the trust of our fellow human beings or the trust of you and your kingdom. Help us always to grow closer to you, respecting property and those things of others as you do as well. We ask these things always in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.